Today's backdrop is on critical race theory and other things going on with culture war bills. CRT is legal theory based in the work of the late Derek Bell and several other legal scholars. He was an NAACP lawyer who supervised 300-some desegregation court cases in the 1960s. He was later a Harvard Law School professor. And his theory is based in 6 theses and several arguments. I'm going to read the arguments just to give you a sense of how technical this is. Constitutional contradiction, the interest convergence principle, and the price of racial remedies. This work is extremely arcane, constrained to the legal field, technical theory. What these scholars were asking essentially was, what explains the persistence of racially discriminatory practices institutionally following all these court cases? This is more than a fair question, and it's set against the backdrop of the Great American Experiment and the American Dream, both of which are profoundly hopeful. So I want to set a backdrop context that CRT is very hopeful. It's very arcane, technical, legal theory. Somebody I know in education is one of the few educators, not legal field people, who has had work published in CRT. She sent me these bullet points. CRT is not taught in the K-12 schools. It's not possible. It's arcane legal theory. It shouldn't be a focus in schools. It's just one framework for addressing inequities. It's kind of redundant, in my opinion, to the practice of our responsibilities in the Great American Experiment, the playbook of citizenship. One interesting thought is in Wisconsin, more than half a century ago, the Packers in the Lombardi era practiced, they set a wonderful example of anti-racism. They didn't call it that, but they did. And this is before CRT really had evolved in legal scholarship. Bell, late in his career, kind of moved on from advocating for desegregation to a focus that schools should improve outcomes for historically marginalized groups. So that's what CRT is. It's very arcane legal scholarship. It's profoundly hopeful. And we have anti-racist K-12 curriculums now today. It's a pretty big movement. And what happened was higher education educators began citing CRT. It's the only way K-12 educators would have ever found out about it. So they're kind of drawing from CRT, but they're really not. They're really more citing it indirectly from higher education. They're drawing some from critical language theory, which almost nobody knows anything about. That's linguistics and sociology. And they're drawing from a lot of different authors, notably Dr. Ibram Kendi and Dr. Robin DiAngelo. Dr. Kendi is a historian. Dr. Robin DiAngelo is sociology and history. And you won't be able to read these, but the top graphic here on the right is from the Madison Metropolitan School District website. It's Racial Justice and Anti-Racism Resources. And it's a real typical way that this is being framed. And my criticism of anti-racist curriculum is mostly that it's not a very complete way to socially construct anything. It's just incomplete. And for example, these anti-racist curriculums are not incorporating the linguistic, anthropological, social construction of people that we see in culturally responsive teaching, and that I tried to backdrop in The Greatest Educational Story Never Told. So what are people reacting to? The hyper-racialization of everything. And this kind of draws from the first thesis of Bell's. Race is a very incomplete way to socially construct people. And that's really kind of a limitation of critical race theory, in my opinion. There's also the simplistic social politicization of things. So I recently heard a University of Wisconsin, Madison Vice Chancellor cite Dr. Kendi and say that only by making people aware of how racist institutions are can we dismantle racism. Well, that seems so overly simplified. If you consider racism a cancer in our practice of democracy, we could look to medicine and ask, how has medicine dismantled cancer? They don't think about it that way. They think about cancer from the science and the humanities. There's a huge gamut of different fields, topics where researchers are continually advancing the science, empirically studying every facet of physiology, chemistry, treatment, the environment, everything. And then through all this new knowledge continually being gleaned, creating new drugs, approaches, diagnostics, whatnot, that the practitioners continually can improve the outcomes with cancer. So they're not just looking at it in a social, political way. Some of the rhetoric in the critical race or in the anti-racist curriculums is hopeless, as opposed to critical race theory, which is hopeful. So for example, I heard a critical language theorists assert that the idea that Black children can get educated out of generational poverty or that white people can become less racist is liberal white fantasy. I disagree, but I had the privilege my entire life of getting to live my whole life with this profoundly hopeful worldview of my life in America, which I think should be everyone's birthright, and it's what we should teach in the public schools. In the identity politics in the elementary curriculum, we heard there's some pretty crazy rhetoric in some of these anti-racist curriculums. You know, white children are responsible to fix racism, which technically they are, but not because they're white and not when they're 5 or 6. And then one of the things I really appreciate about anti-racist curriculum is the need for people to know a more complete history of the United States. So I didn't learn about the industrial scale of slavery, for example, until I was 63. In an Atlantic article by Ta-Nehisi Coates, I was in Tulsa 15 years ago when I learned about the Tulsa Massacre. I learned about the Redeemer era from a library book by Henry Louis Gates I checked out of the library 2 years ago. I mean, these are big things about our history we should learn in high school, but not so that we, the Caucasian oppressors, can self-flagellate or feel guilty or responsible. We're all together responsible to run the great American experiment. We're responsible to be informed, to be knowledgeable. We're supposed to be capable of reason, and we're supposed to be introspective. So I don't want to put people down who might be kind of in a self-flagellative place now. I think everybody who's trying to be more knowledgeable, introspective, our appreciation is continually evolving. This brings us to the culture war bills. Wisconsin wrote a doozy this last year. They were going to ban everything, and I think the legislature knew it would be vetoed by the governor, but it set a terrible example. We had a 7-hour legislative hearing where people fought about critical race theory. The legislators are very incompletely informed. We're setting a terrible example for our children, fighting about things that are important, but not in a way that's completely informed, thinking about banning things. The K-12 educators are getting almost no leadership from or information from the Federal Department of Education, from DPI, from our governor, who was the state superintendent. This is really the way to move forward and to mediate so much of this. Again, banning is completely infeasible. Here's my final element to the backdropping of this. What's going to drive these culture bills this year, culture war bills, is the elections. And it's going to really get ugly, I think. And what's driving it doesn't have anything to do with CRT, anti-racist curriculum, racial justice, or even identity politics. It's solely about voter suppression. And it's not just about suppressing the votes of Black Americans. And I think we all really need to understand this, because this is a deliberate attempt to divide everybody and undermine our practice of democracy.